If you go inside most organizations and poke around and see what they're working on, which is what I get to do, you find that organizations are not spending very much time at all working on blockbuster ideas. They're spending almost all of their effort, all of their resources, all of their time focusing on small ideas, incremental ideas, tiny ideas, which are important because we need them to stay competitive, but they're not going to change the game. They're not going to be the things that kind of bias this insurance policy into the future, like the iPhones.
Well, hello, Elvin. What a pleasure to be here with you virtually.
Yeah, likewise. Really, really looking forward to our conversation, Rita.
Me too. So, what I thought maybe would be a great place to start is tell us a little bit about your journey. And then I definitely want to get to this moment I have been waiting for literally 4 years of opening the package that this book gets in.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, quick potted history. So I've worked in the innovation strategy and change space for a long time, 25, 30 years, I suppose now. It's generally been working with large corporates around the world, but it tends to be in response to the question, don't tell us why, don't tell us what, just tell us how to innovate. And there is still a large appetite in many organizations that I work with to figure out, how do you turn on innovation culture? How do you keep it turned on? And how do we stop today the status quo from smothering the development of the future that we all know we need to create? So I end up doing a lot of executive coaching, working with executive teams on how do you figure out, what does an innovation strategy look like? How do we turn it on right down at a team level, and how do we keep it moving? So quite varied leadership programs, more writing. I'm working on some MBA programs right now. And I love change. I love the variety of it. So I need lots of different things to keep me interested.
It sounds like you enjoy working in ambiguous situations.
I do. I love it. It's if I'm not doing something new every few months, something's wrong. You've got to be learning something, trying something, failing somewhere. It's all good.
So what do you see? And this is a thing that puzzles me and has for years, which is, you talk about 30 years, right? So say 30 years ago, what were we in the 90s? So much of what's needed to be innovative is actually pretty well understood. I mean, we know about the sort of jobs to be done from Clay Christensen and Tony Ulwick, and of course Alex Osterwalder talks about that. We know about planning to learn, which I've talked about. We know about what has to be true. We know about spend a little bit to validate your assumptions before you make big commitments to uncertain futures. And we know all this, and yet companies seem kind of oblivious in many cases.
When you say we know this, I think probably you and I do, and probably the people who are watching, who are interested in innovation. I continue to be surprised that when I'm standing in a room and I'll get out the Lean Startup and say, so who's read the Lean Startup? Anyone heard of the Lean Startup? Anyone? And seriously, 30, 50 people in a room, I just get a couple of hands go up. Okay, so who's actually read it? One hand will go down. Who's read more than the back cover? And even if you've read it, have you turned it into action? So I think a lot of these ideas, while some of them might be familiar, there's that journey to actually turning them into action and actually making it process. How do you turn some of these things into process? And what I observe, at least inside many organizations, is the strategy development process really hasn't changed very much. It's rolling forward still. What happened last year? How can we extrapolate forward based on what we already know? Not taking into account the fact that the half-life of our experience, the worth of our skills and capabilities is actually shrinking faster than ever. And so the things that we're trying to push forward have less and less relevance than they have done before. And yet, quite often what I see is trying to explore the future using old tools, old ways of thinking from the past, and not actually being able to grapple with the reality of the pursuit of relevance, which for me is what this is all about. How do we continually pursue profitable relevance? And even though we might say the books are written, even though the MBA courses are out there, I think most organizations are still turning the wheels, trying to figure out, how do we how do we solve tomorrow's problems using today's tools or yesterday's tools? And it still isn't working.
Well, and that's what people are comfortable with, right? So a couple of points I would make is, firstly, I see this huge gap between strategy. So when strategy is done right, it's pulling you into the future, which is awesome, right? And then you've got budgets, and where does this year's budget start? It starts with last year's budget, right? And so budgets are anchoring you in some kind of past. Then you've got your project governance process, which is usually a complete mess. You pick up the lid on just about any corporation's portfolio, and with very few exceptions, it's a disaster. There's stuff in there that was the CEO's pet bunny from 5 years ago, and nobody's bothered to stop and say, why are we doing this again? As you've pointed out in your TED Talk, small ideas, things that are never going to be meaningful to a company. I was on a call with a company just yesterday, and they got this big, ambitious tech thing that they're doing. And I said, well, okay, so your company is X billion in revenue today. Your CEO has announced this super important growth plan that they want to do. How big does this thing have to have the potential to be? And I get this blank stare, like nobody's ever asked the question. So strategy, budgets, project governance, and then people. And one of the questions I ask on an innovation survey that I sometimes administer with companies is, what's in it for you if you engage in innovation? And all too often people say, oh, it's like, I'm not rewarded for it. I'm not compensated for it. If I engage in it and something goes wrong, it's all on me. It's like the complete opposite of the system that you really want to build.
I think the other thing I observe is, quite often I'll have an executive say to me, innovation just isn't working here. And I've learned that isn't true. What they really mean is we're just getting incremental ideas. The only ideas that come forward are the ones that we know in advance will make it through the system. And that generally puts a fairly low ceiling on the amount of creativity and disruptive thinking that's allowed to apply to it. And I think that the challenge that organizations need to grasp is, what's the future that we need to create? What level of, or what portfolio of innovation is that going to require, from transformative through to incremental? And then the key is, okay, so how do we calibrate the context that we create inside our organization so that that whole world in innovation can show up? Because we tend to measure and create a context around incremental only, and anything above that doesn't have a home. It doesn't have a budget. It doesn't have generally a leadership that has the experience on how to lead that stuff, most of which is going to fail. So calibrating to context for me is everything. And if we're only calibrating to the level of what we know how to do, we can only expect at best people to come with ideas that are realistic, i.e. the ones where we already know the outcome. And we're not really looking for discovery. We're not really looking to explore and discover new things with a lot of ambiguity aligned to them. When a company starts to be deliberate about calibrating the context that's required for some of those things to show up, then I start to see more success. And we're looking at what do we need at the team level, incremental improvements, continuous improvements. What do we need in what I call rehearsal space, more rehearsal space, so that some of the ideas that we don't know, we don't even understand the problem space, yet alone the solution. What do they look like? What chances do they need, or what context do they need around them, so they have the best possible chance of thriving and succeeding later down the line?
One of the things I've been playing around with as part of this context of creating innovation is something called the permissionless organization, which, if you think about it, if senior leadership, whatever they are, figures out, okay, here's the strategy, here's the context, here are the goals, here's what we're trying to achieve, here's a pot of resources, which can be fairly readily accessed up to a point by people with ideas, that if you can get that tuned, right, what you start to see is you break down the innovation problem into pieces. So let's just say you've got a really audacious idea. I don't know, provide services across the globe for all fast food restaurants, right? Well, the way most companies do that is they assign a team. It becomes the fast food restaurant project. And that team is, in all likelihood, also working on other projects. Sometimes, if you're lucky, they get to work in a dedicated way on this. But it's like the whole project is all lumped together. And instead, what this permissionless structure allows you to do is break it down. And some people call that agile. Some people talk about sprints, where I'm going to take 2 weeks and I'm just going to figure out the cleaning fluid, right? And then we're going to take another team working in parallel. And this is important for compressing timescales. Another team working in parallel might say, okay, I'm just going to work on worker scheduling, and another team might say, I'm going to work on the surfaces. Like, what do the surfaces need to look like? And so then you've got this work going on in parallel, and then you can bring together all these small teams into a larger agglomeration where you sort of now begin to see the whole picture. And it's a really different way of working. And I think we're starting to acknowledge that could actually be a way of getting to a much more innovative outcome without having to expose ourselves to the risk of like one team just doing this one thing.
Yeah, I love that. And the thing that I'd like to build on around that, and it's finally we're in a lunchtime slot in the UK this morning, and this afternoon I'm actually running a workshop on this very issue, which is understanding, here's the focus, here's the context, here's the needles we're trying to move with innovation and all of the things that you've just described. And team, you are being given the freedom, the accountability to design the specific context in which your team will do its best work. And we'll be able to do all of that stuff, on steroids. So how do we need to show up for one another? How do we need to hold one another to positive account? What does it take to do our best work here in how we communicate and how we measure? And you give the team at that, even at the team level, the ability to create the context that they need to thrive. So you look at Netflix, you look at Spotify, they figured this out a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, it's starting to catch on. It's not just the work, not just the focus of what the innovation needs to be, but it's handing the mandate for the curation of the culture at the team level to allow them to determine how are we going to show up best to move the needle that the organization needs us to move.
Well, and it also implies fewer hierarchical layers and a lot less sort of structure in the traditional way. So these teams, and Spotify is a great example. I mean, these teams are multifunctional. So the team has everything it needs. It's not waiting to hear from finance. It's not handing the thing over to marketing. It's not, it's not broken up that way, because we now, with today's technologies, we don't need to do that, right? We have all the skills we need in one place. And a lot of the stuff managers used to do, my like prototypical manager walking around the place with a clipboard, getting status updates, right? Why do you need to do that when you can have Jira or any of these other platforms that it's all right there? Like, why do you need to go ask people what's going on? Just have a look for yourself. And so what that does is it flattens hierarchies. It creates multifunctional capability, and it allows these teams to move much faster. And my thesis would be, and I'm working actually on an article with Ram Charan about this, my thesis would be that those are going to create competitive advantages, which are very difficult for traditionally organized companies to compete with.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think some of that is culture is still seen as mysterious.
Yeah.
The secret sauce of how do you get people to do anything? How do you create an environment where people can truly do their best work without fear? Is still something that most senior leaders struggle with, I think. And we're so busy trying to manage the process, and yet we still haven't figured out this people piece. And yet, as you said earlier, so much has been written about it. It's the whole field of organizational psychology has grown tremendously in the last 10 years particularly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet still some of it hasn't filtered down on how do human beings best do their best work, particularly in the context of ambiguity and exploration and unknownness moving forward.
Yeah, you and I met years ago when I was doing some work with Boots, the UK
Yeah, that's right.
retailer, pharmacy chain, and Jesse Boots originated the whole idea of what we would think of today as the modern pharmacy, or chemist's shop, as you might say. And they, he scandalized his sector by actually coming up with this idea that, you know, you could actually make medicine in a standardized way and sell it to the masses. Before that, people have forgotten this. Before that, you had formularies, right? And to get
Mm.
medicine, like the pharmacist had to create it for you out of jars, and you know, they would sort of pour it on a scale and compound it for you, and that was how you got your medicine. And Boots was one of the very first to mass market medicine. But when I was doing some work for them, I actually got to visit the family manse. And the reason I raise it is because the dining room there was clearly set up to reflect the corporate structure of the time. And there was silverware, and depending on your hierarchical level in the company, you got a certain place setting or not. There was this like super formal order of service that you did. And it was so fascinating to me because, of course, by the time I was working with Boots, it was a completely different organization. They'd
Mm.
really taken differentiation on customer service very much to heart, and they were fantastic. I mean, they were really, really doing a great job. And you walk into a Boots store, and you know, you feel valued as a customer. You know, there's a sort of a culture of kind of polite joshing, you know, and that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And they really built that very deliberately. But I thought it was so
Mm.
fascinating to watch that journey from this like familial manse, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to
Oh, that's a great story.
it
Really
is.
good.
So I don't want us to miss this opportunity to talk about the book. So before the pandemic, you very, very kindly sent me a copy of your book called Be Less Zombie in this fantastic red envelope. There you go, a picture of you sending it off.
Oh my
And I
goodness. There
set
we
it
go.
aside because I thought, right, we're going to get together sometime and I'll open it like in your presence. And it has been very lovingly in my library for the last 2 years. I think now may be the time to open it up. What do you think?
I think you better. I think you better.
Well, it's very well sealed, so I'll have to resort to stronger measures. All right, so here we go.
Okay, here we go.
You've done a
Now,
fantastic
now I'm worried that I didn't put something else in there as well. I can't remember.
Let's see. Ta-da! Here
There
we
we
are.
go.
Be Less Zombie, Alvin Turner. So it's been waiting. It's been waiting to be discovered by me for 2 years now. So, what got you to think of the title? Because apparently your wife persuaded you that this cover was better than some alternatives, is what I've been told.
Yeah, let's said the better. But yes, well, it came about actually. It was on an exec ed program, and I was asked to come and talk about what is it about these unicorns. You know, what makes these unicorns different? What is it that they're doing that we're not? So it's at the beginning of the day, and I just got the whole group to stand in a line. And I said, listen, let's just figure out how unicorn we are. So at one end of the room, I want, if you feel like you're an organization that has attributes much like these unicorns, I want you to stand at this end of the line. And the other, we need something else at the other end of the line. And we just came up with zombie. You know, an organization that's lurching for its next meal. It's the living dead. So we just drew this line, and I said, okay, go and take positions. And everybody ran to the zombie end, which I wasn't really expecting. I was thinking, okay, so we need to talk about how to be less zombie and maybe a little bit more unicorn, although that's not necessarily the right answer, being more unicorn, but definitely be less zombie. And it kind of went from there, and the publisher liked it. So we just took it forward almost as a bit of fun. And it's a very different title as a business book.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. And so you've also had some fun with myself and my colleague, Alex Osterwalder. And
Yeah.
I was very flattered to be depicted as a superhero.
Well, yeah, you're one of the innovation superheroes out there, Rita. Let's, Thinkers 50 validates that. So,
That was fun.
well, Alex was kind enough to allow himself to be. There we go. That's how Alex shows up in the book. He was happy to have a bit of fun surfing on a business model canvas. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to have a picture of you as well. So Richard Johnson, the illustrator, kindly put pen to paper and came up with some fun pictures.
It was definitely a first. So I think we have some questions coming in. Shall we?
Yeah, let's have a look.
What our viewers want to learn about?
So, Elvin, how does the research you've done on strategies for innovation management complement and integrate with the work which Rita has done? Oh my goodness, Stephen Bussey, thank you. Well, I'm just going to be honest. Rita I hope this doesn't embarrass you, but Rita's been one of my real role models, actually, and a lot of her earlier writing has been the basis that I've built on, really. So, right back through, I was just telling Rita before we came on air, the question that I probably use more than any other, and these days in trying to help frame conversations around discovery, is what would need to be true. Such a powerful question when we're trying to understand. The reason I like it, Rita, let me tell you this. One of the reasons I like this question so much is that it assumes that the problem you're trying to solve can be solved. And I've learned that when you say what would need to be true, and therefore we're not putting, it's not up for debate whether this can be solved or not. It can be solved. It seems to shift the psychology in the room and burst the bubble that the status quo can kind of put around your imagination. So putting out there the expectation that this can be solved, we just need to figure out how. That's such an elegant question. What would need to be true in order to do that? So for me, in answer to your question, Stephen, I think Rita's work, covers so many areas, but the area that I've appreciated a lot has been discovery-driven growth. The requirement to always be searching, to always be in discovery mode, not just replication mode of what we've done before. And I guess what I tried to do with Be Less Zombie is to go down to, well, not to go down to another level of detail, but to look at some alternative tools and some complementary tools that help you dig deeper, that help you look at things from different vantage points to allow new ideas to come forward. But also then to look at what does it take to create a culture of discovery using the fantastic strategic tools that Rita and others have put together. But then, okay, how does that show up at a team level? How do we make that process? How do we make that instinct? How do we make that reflex in a way that perhaps it hasn't been before?
I would add on also, how do you make it comfortable for people? My good friend Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety.
Yeah.
And I think, what often happens in organizations is we bring our old habits into our new situations. And so, if you're trying to price a product, right, someone will say 43, I think the answer is 43. And then we get into this whole debate about whether it's 43, 44, 42, and we get anchored, right, on being right. And then we get into this defensive crouch about, no, I said 43, therefore that's what it must be.
Yeah.
And I try to tell people that you have no facts. You don't know. I mean, the reality is all of us right now are in a very high assumption to knowledge ratio situation. We have an unknown future with the pandemic. We have geopolitical issues that are pretty horrifying right now, and we don't know where all that's going to lead. We don't know what the next new technology is going to be. I mean, let's just admit we don't know. And if you admit you don't know, then why argue about being right? Oh, so I think we have a question in from Matt Hardy, one of my colleagues at Columbia.
Okay, so suggestions for moving great ideas, prototypes out of high-performing cross-functional teams for larger company scale, which are organized by function silos. Rita, I'll let you lead with that one.
Sure. So if you think about innovation, and hi, Matt, by the way, if you think about innovation, there's really 3 phases it goes through, right, at a high level. So you've got the ideation phase, which is all about finding those great ideas that could be breakthroughs. And lots of companies think that's the problem. And Eldon, I don't know about you, but in my experience, ideas are not the problem. Humans are ingenious creatures. We have ideas all the time. Then you have incubation, which is finding a place in the company to sort of say, well, here's my idea for a 3D printing enabled book publishing operation, right? Whatever it is. But now I've got to go incubate. I've got to test for product market fit. I've got to figure out whether the thing is really worth spending, a big amount of money on and so forth. And then you've got something I call acceleration. And acceleration is the moment you're talking about, Matt, which is now my little incubated thing, right? You can think of it as being on the on-ramp. And it's got to join my main company. And my main company's chugging along. It's like an 80 mile an hour, 80 kilometer an hour process in a 6-lane highway. And somehow I have to bring it to maturity. So the first question that you need to figure out is, where is its organizational home? So does it belong belong to a business unit? Is it going to be its own business unit? Is it going to be some kind of hybrid where we break things up, which is IBM did very, very successfully with their Emerging Business Opportunity Program. So where's it going to go? And then what has to be in place for it to become a mature business? Because this is the transition, right? This is the moment you're going to go from this little, Safi Bakal calls them loon shots, right? This little loon shot to, you're joining the marching armies of soldiers. And so you have to do a number of very specific things. You have to allow corporate process in. So you may have been holding off procurement and legal and compliance and HR for all that time. Now you got to invite them in. You've got to bring in different kinds of people. So all of your, visionary ninja creator titles have to kind of become, well, no, actually you're an EVP of whatever, and you have to bring to maturity your quality processes and all that stuff. And so there's an actual transition which has to happen. And the hero in this transition is a character I call the organizational Sherpa. And Sherpas, the reason I use the word is that just like the Sherpa who's going to help you navigate Mount Everest, right? And this is the person who's going to say, oh, wow, it's looks like rain today. I suggest we wait here till tomorrow. Or, oh, with the way the wind is blowing, this is the best path I would recommend. The organizational Sherpas are the people with the deep knowledge of the organization, the credibility of their position. They've often been with the company for a very long time. And the thing that excites them is this job. It's meshing together the old with the new and sort of managing the politics around that. So I'll just spend a minute on the IBM EBO program, their Emerging Business Opportunity Program, because I think it's a very nice example. So this is under Lou Gerstner, and he had a number two who was a senior staff person who was solely responsible for their new business innovations. And what they would do is they would take a fairly senior, well-respected person and put them in charge of an opportunity area. So let's say pervasive computing, which today we would call the Internet of Things, right? And so this senior person, a guy named Adkin, he was running all of IBM's Unix business. So this is a guy with 30,000 people reporting to him. He got relieved of that job and put in charge of figuring out pervasive computing. And he had maybe a staff of 5 analysts to go figure this out. And as they began to learn about this new opportunity space, what they did, and this was smart, they started to take units out of the established business and fold them into this EBO. So this does a couple of really interesting things. It gives the EBO heft, it gives it some structure, and it gives it revenue, and it also gives it this capability. So you're creating this fascinating meshing between the old organization and the new one. And that's one of the more interesting examples I've seen of this exact process, going from a startup to becoming its own kind of thing. And in Gerstner's time, I believe they did 23 EBOs, of which 17 or 18 went on to become billion-dollar businesses. I mean, wow. Really successful. Yeah,
really good. I think one other thing that I've observed in that whole space as well is organizations that do that well are also very good at, again, the human journey of what is this going to mean when this organization becomes part of us? What is that going to do? What unintended consequences, positive and negative, are going to happen when this new entity enters us? What's it going to do around decision making? What's it going to do around capacity? What's it going to do around strategic planning? Because it won't be a seamless transition, and no one will even blink. There will be a ripple effect. And I think these organizational Sherpas that you talked about are also usually very gifted at anticipating the human implication of these transitions. I remember I did some work briefly with a guy called Ed Lu, who used to be a space shuttle pilot. And he always talked a lot about one of the most important things that would happen when you were up in space, whether you were with a space station or whether you're on a space shuttle, was interfacing. The point at which a space shuttle connects with another thing and the hatch opens, the orchestration required leading up to that, during and afterwards is incredibly complicated. And the extent to which we think it through and plan it and bring in people who are expert in interfacing and transition is really important. And I think very often it's easy to fall into the trap of, well, it's functional, we'll just slap them together, we'll figure it out as we go, and surprise, surprise, many many of these things fall to pieces. So I think that I love the idea of the organizational Sherpa as, you know, the expert, not only of the journey, but of the human condition that's required around it to succeed.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, what changes are happening in strategy offices or need to happen? Emerging practices. Well, I've got a live example, if I can. I'll
Sure.
just share quickly on this. I guess it depends which kind of organization you go into. I'm finding these days that they fall into two categories for me. One is there's quite a sophisticated strategy outfit. There's a good insights program. They're good at scenario planning, good at figuring out plausible alternative futures. The area for improvement that I'm seeing people trying to lean into more is taking what can be theory and turning it into practice. How do you take those insights and make them meaningful? And I've been working recently with one of the electricity companies in the UK, and they have this fantastic scenario planning outfit. The reports they produce are wonderful. They look beautiful, full of great insights. Then when you talk to the people on the ground who are responsible for turning strategy into action, they often haven't even seen these things. And even if they do, they're still at a level of operationalization, which makes it very difficult for them to work with. So there is this piece in the middle. It's like an interpretation piece. It's how do we take the theory, the ideas, the weak signals that do seem to be coming from the future and actually make them meaningful? And I think one of the superpowers that I see in some organizations that do this well is they're very good at seeing what's missing. They see the detail of what's coming, or at least an emerging picture, and they can see the thing that needs to show up in the future that isn't there yet, and they can turn that into something actionable. So there's this translation piece that I'm seeing at one level. I don't know if you recognize that, Rita, whether you've seen that in other places.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would say that the biggest challenges I see chief strategy officers or strategy offices facing is they have no power. So the organization largely ignores them. So I think if you're going to have innovation as a core part of your future operation, you need to give those people some real power over resources, over what comes and goes, over people, and so forth. So Alvin, I think we are just about out of time. The book is Be Less Zombie. After 2 years of waiting, it's finally out.
Glad you got it. Glad you got it.
So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And Alvin, thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, likewise, Rita. Lovely to spend time with you today.
I enjoy connecting to people who have different, diverse backgrounds. In my job, every day I have an opportunity to interact with people from all over the world, which makes it incredibly rewarding. So in my book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen, I look at the critical issue of strategic inflection points. One of the more challenging aspects of the transformation that a lot of companies are contemplating today, while they're looking at digital transformation and they're looking at global supply chains and they're looking at things that are really requiring them to behave in a very different way than they have historically, is how do we master all the levers of change that we need to be pulling in order to make something actually work.